Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. We are delighted to share with you today a discussion on the first paper that the IAA Water Task Force produced. I'm joined by my very capable fellow authors, which I'll introduce to you shortly. They are also panel members today, and so we will today speak about what we found during the first paper as we wrote it, and it was published recently. Before we get into the discussion, I just want to share some housekeeping. First of all, the verbal capabilities have been turned off for participants. However, you can use the question tab at the bottom to submit any questions you may have, and we will see how many questions we can deal with during the discussion. There's also a recording that will be made available on YouTube and the IAA website in the next few days. On the next slide. And this is just to take note of the disclaimer, which you will also find in the pack as you receive it later. So, before I introduce everyone, let me just give you a little bit of background about the IAA's Water Risk Task Force and how it came to be. The Water Risk Task Force statement of intent was approved by Council on 27 May 2023, after which we kicked off activities. From the outset, we had very good international FMA cooperation and involvement. And we've got a fairly wide team of members and observers in the Water Risk Task Force. The IAA believed that it's a strategic topic, important for the well-being of society, and it's gaining more and more public attention, including from supranational organizations, and therefore that the IAA has a role to play. The objective of the SOI was to prepare the IAA as a voice for the actuarial profession to proactively engage with supranational organizations on water-related risks and provide actuarial perspectives in its own activities. Furthermore, to advance the competency of the profession by creating awareness, facilitate knowledge sharing, and educating actuaries about this very important topic. And then lastly, to promote the role of the actuary in emerging wider fields to raise its profile. So to introduce our panel today, starting briefly with myself, I'm an actuary fellow of the Actuarial Society of South Africa, as well as the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. I'm a certified enterprise risk actuary and chair of the Water Risk Task Force. And with me, I have Hayley Clark, who's a co-author as well. She's the Chief Actuarial Officer at SASRIAF in South Africa. That's the Special Risk Insurance Association, overseeing actuarial quality assurance and business intelligence functions. She's a fellow of the Actuarial Society of South Africa and ACERA, and she brings a lot of experience in reinsurance and risk management across sub-Saharan Africa. Her passion lies in addressing climate change and fostering sustainable development. Based in Boston, we've got Sarah Goldberg. She's Vice President and Actuary at RGA of the Reinsurance Group of America, where she focuses on mortality and emerging risks. She's a fellow of the SOA. She's held leadership roles in global actuarial and climate risk initiatives, including at PwC in January. She also serves on the IAA Water Risk Task Force. Based in London, we've got Emily Forsyth Davis. She's head of environmental, social and governance at Aurum Research Limited, responsible for shaping the firm's ESG strategy and investment approach. Qualified actuary, member of the IFA, and also holder of the CFA UK certificate in ESG investing. She has a strong background in sustainable finance and responsible investment, advising pension schemes and corporate clients on ESG integration. And then very, very happy also to have Lila Davies with us. She's a policy analyst at the OECD Environment Directorate, leading initiatives on water-related financial risks and policy dialogues with emerging economies. Lila travels all over the world advising governments on policies, and so we were delighted also that she helped us in formulating the first paper. Her work supports the development of reforms to address global water challenges, bridging environmental sustainability and financial resilience. In order for us to all have a good background, I'm going to ask Hayley Clark to give us an overview of the paper in a few minutes.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. So, as we mentioned already, today we're sharing some of the insights from our first paper from the Water Risk Task Force. And what we will then do is build on this paper with further papers that delve more into detail. So, to start off, water is arguably the single resource that is critical to both life and economic stability. While Earth is known as the blue planet because of the amount of water that we have, in fact, only 3% of the water on Earth is fresh water. And then 30% of this fresh water comes from groundwater sources such as aquifers. And these aquifers are actually depleting, and it's quite unfortunate because it's not visible. So it's quite different to where we have dams. We can see how dam levels drop. But when there's water stress, we don't necessarily see the depletion of aquifers. So there's a lot less awareness in this space. We also have desalination that accounts for less than 3% of consumable fresh water. And again, this is something that's notoriously environmentally unfriendly. Around the world, agriculture is the largest user of fresh water, but this also needs to be balanced against the competing needs of industrial and domestic use. What we do see is that consumption follows a supply and demand dynamic, where supply is somewhat undependable, yet largely out of human hands on a short-term basis. Demand, on the other hand, is wholly within our control, but again is also somewhat rigid on a short-term basis. Now, the distribution of water varies considerably geographically, and there's also a lot of inequality that we see among societies. And then for all the life and health actuaries, about 70% of diseases are also waterborne. Now, if we look to the future, the demand for water is increasing substantially. And we know that climate change is having a big impact on the hydrological cycle. So, climate change and water risks are very closely linked. However, I will mention that even before considering the future climate change aspect, there have always been substantial water risks. And looking back in time, actually, the rise and fall of civilizations have often been linked to water risks. I mean, for example, the Akkadian Empire was suspected to have collapsed following a prolonged drought. So, and there have also been many other examples through the years. This slide now sets out a map of water risks around the world. And water risks can most simply be described as too much, too little, or too dirty. The map on the left looks at the sufficiency, so that being either too much or too little around the world. And what we can see is the darker areas are the places where there are more risks. And then the map on the right looks at the quality of the water around the world, which again shows the high risk areas. What we can see is that very few areas globally rank as low risk across both dimensions. What we do know is that different geographical areas have different water risks and differing ability to actually manage these risks. So a couple of examples are in sub-Saharan Africa, we're highly dependent on rain-fed subsistence agriculture, so very impacted in seasons where there is lower than average rainfall. In South Asia, I mean, there is irrigated agriculture, which depends very much on river runoff. It's not only a global south problem that we see with water, but also some sophisticated nations or some nations with quite sophisticated water infrastructure are also struggling. For example, Germany has been experiencing worsening impacts from floods, specifically because of climate change. And there's also compounding water problems. So, for example, in Jakarta, what we see is the sea level is rising at the same time that the city is sinking due to overuse and inadequate management of groundwater. What's actually happened is that parts of northern Jakarta have sunk by around 4.5 meters over the last 50 years. And they also experience regular flooding because of the rivers that are running through the city, as well as sea level rise, which impacts them in terms of saltwater intrusion and further flooding. Now, beyond the physical risk, there's also the aspect of transition risk, which related to water arises from things like changes in regulations and policies that would maybe adjust the allocation of water resources or alter quality standards or increase the cost of water use. So in the paper, we go into quite a bit of detail on the different types of water risks, where we can further break it down into water risks linked to water as a resource and water risks linked to water as a hazard. So from a resource point of view, it mostly relates to sufficient clean water, which links to the treatment and infrastructure. While from a hazard point of view, we look at things like flood, sea level rise, as well as tsunami and storm surges. And these water risks have impacts across many different dimensions, and there's often a variety of water risks impacting each areas. So just as an example there on the slide, we can see the issue of food security and how that links back to so many different areas of water risk as both water as a resource and water as a hazard. The paper then also goes on to talk about how these water risks relate to the economy, including areas such as global trade and markets. We talk a bit about the societal impacts, so things like water justice and food security and health, and then also the impacts on nature. But given that we are actuaries and we're talking about this, we need to bring it back to what it means for us as a profession. And what can actually be seen as the impacts are quite varied and really depend on which practice area you're looking at it from. And that's something that we're going to discuss a bit further within the discussion. But finally, I'd just say it's very important to be aware that water risk is extremely interrelated with other risks, and it's entrenched in nearly every aspect of both the financial systems as well as our own lives. Now I'm going to hand over back to Andries.
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, that's a wonderful summary. Took us months to write, and you so eloquently summarized it in a few minutes. Well done. So I must say one of the key aspects for me was from the statistics you shared, how geared the freshwater available system is, and a few levers in the big parts of the water around the world, if it changes, how it could so dramatically impact the 3% of fresh water. Thanks for that. So, Laila, can I ask you if you could share a bit of the work of the OECD? I know the OECD does wonderful work around the world on water risks, also including some of the recent papers that the OECD has published.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's really a pleasure to be here and also to follow the great work you guys are doing in the Water Risk Task Force. So maybe to start off, I'll just give a bit of a background on the OECD for those who may not be familiar. So the OECD is an intergovernmental organization which brings together governments of 38 member countries committed to democracy and market economy. Our work involves helping member countries formulate policies, but also supporting developing countries and promoting policy reforms on a range of different policy areas. So on water in particular, we have a wealth of work across the OECD and our different directorates, which touches on water quality, water policies, governance, water-related finance, adaptation, and more. And so my particular area within this is working on water-related risks to financial systems, and of course with this focus on fresh water. So why are we working on water-related risks? Well, I think Haley's presentation did a fantastic job of laying out what the sources of these risks are with respect to water. So I won't come back to that. But the reason we're working on this in terms of the financial system is because we have this understanding that water-related risks are not fully captured by financial risk management practices. So this means that at a financial institution, so at the financial institution level, we're at an early stage of reporting on and assessing exposure to water-related risks. And water, which falls under both climate and nature, is not explicitly reflected in our global prudential standards that safeguard our financial systems. And as I mentioned, because water falls in these two categories, climate and nature, which are heavily interlinked, our current approaches to looking at water are in early stages and only partial. So, of course, on the climate front, central banks are increasingly looking at water-related risks through scenarios of drought and floods, with increasing stress tests and guidance and prudential disclosures. The understanding of nature-related risks, so these are water risks which are driven by economic activities beyond climate change, so our use of water and our pollution of water, are the work that's being done to understand the impacts of nature-related risks on the financial system is in very much earlier stages. and very few central banks and financial supervisors have really provided guidance on this. And we see a key challenge of that being the siloed approach between the finance community and the environment and water community. And so that's why it's really excellent to see initiatives like this, which help also bridge that gap on understanding water risks and how they can materialize in the economy and in the financial system. Next slide, please. So our work on this topic really aims to bridge that gap between the finance and the water community. Our key focus right now is on supporting financial supervisors and central banks in understanding water-related risks, helping policymakers, regulators, and financial authorities better communicate to support improved decision-making across economic sectors and financial systems. Because as was mentioned, water really spans across economies and different aspects of our lives. And also to help stakeholders identify where and how they need to build additional capacity and develop partnerships, because this knowledge doesn't lie in one single location, but across many different stakeholders, for us to better assess the financial implications of water-related risks. So our work has really focused on assessing tools and frameworks, sharing knowledge and good practices in assessments of water-related risks, and also facilitating this cross-sector collaboration across stakeholders. And so we've recently published a report as well on embedding water-related risks into financial stability frameworks, which really aims to focus on the unique challenges posed by water and share existing and emerging tools to support central banks and supervisors. But we've also held a number of workshops with central banks, and we'll be working at COP30 also with some events on water risk, and we'll be holding some roundtables next year as well. So maybe I'll stop there and allow us to move into the interesting discussion we have ahead.
Thank you so much, Laila. So I do note so many important aspects in the work you do and that of the Directorate, and we're delighted that you continue to help us, guide our efforts in the Water Risk Task Force. Sarah, maybe to start with you, we do often note, and it's tempting to think of water risk as purely related to climate risk and climate change. Of course, it is a very important aspect. Could you elaborate for us a little bit on how does water risk tie into climate change and actuaries' understanding of climate risk?
Yes, happy to do so. Thank you, Andres. And first, let me just say I'm so pleased to be here today, and it's also been fabulous to work with my co-authors in the task force on this important paper. And it's wonderful to be here today on behalf of the IAA because we represent such geographic diversity amongst the associations. And while actuaries are relatively small in the broader, global professional opportunities. It's a big world around us, and we still have a big world of practice areas and challenges that we face. And so just to say that as we were drafting this paper, a little window into our world is how do we represent the diversity of practice areas that we have, and how do we put this, make this topic relevant for different geographies and different practice areas. I believe that it's relevant to us all. So the first step is to increase literacy. And so back to your question, Andres, if I could ask, if we could go back to the flow chart as we talk about water risk and climate change, navigating back there. Some of these, what I'll call impact pathways and the gray boxes towards the bottom, will mean and have varying importance to certain people and less relevant to others. But the point is that, if you take, for example, spread of disease as an impact pathway to how this is relevant, spread of disease, certain diseases will not be endemic to certain areas, but may become endemic. And so at first blush, we may say, that doesn't apply to me. And I think that's part of the paradigm is the shift in what will become relevant in the next 20, 50 years, et cetera. So in terms of how do we understand climate risk versus water risk? As Haley has already laid out, these two concepts are highly interrelated. I like to think in terms of Venn diagrams, and maybe there's a lot that's on top of each other, but what distinguishes a water risk from climate risk would be, in my mind, the water resource component to the left. And so if we think of the water withdrawal rates and the water tables, you can see that our withdrawal rate is outpacing water availability. So that water as a resource, both in quantity and quality, is at risk. So our drinking water, right? And then water as a hazard, if we think of that in terms of flood risk, Hurricane Melissa is very topical this week, and I mean, historically catastrophic. That is water as a hazard. So if we think in simplistic terms, what is water risk? It's too much water, too little water, and everything that comes with it. So now, how do actuaries understand it? I will say that climate risk provides a framework and a foundation. I don't think I'm going to get into that too much in terms of the quantification of climate risk, but we have good framework and foundations for both modeling that and classifying that. And that foundation provides a lift when we think about how to expand that for water risk. So to summarize, in some ways, climate risk is a component of water risk, and then water risk is a component of climate risk. So hopefully I haven't confused you too much, Andres. Back to you.
Vera. No, that's
Yeah.
that's very, very good. Thank you. Yes, the flow chart that we present in the paper, I think, does summarize the proliferation of the risk quite nicely. Thanks for that. And maybe a good way to actually highlight the water resource component of it. Emily, how does the Thames water case study illustrate the long-term risks of underinvestment? I know that globally in many countries and regions, the financing of water-related infrastructure is a big challenge. Can you highlight for us how the Thames water case study that we looked at in the report teaches us something about that?
Absolutely. I think the perception would be that the UK would have, particularly good water services. And obviously, relative to a number of developing countries, we certainly do. We have high quality water, and we generally have had very reliable water for a very long time. We have some of the oldest water infrastructure in the world as a result. And people will be aware that there was a large privatization program in the UK under our previous Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And water services were privatized in 1989. So a significant time ago, makes a reasonable time length for a case study. Unfortunately, privatization of water services, as often happens when monopolies are privatized, has led to a number of difficulties. So significantly large dividends were paid out from these utility companies, but there was also significant underinvestment and failing infrastructure. And what often happens in these cases is you don't notice that the infrastructure is failing for a significant amount of time. Things continue as they happen for a while. And this has led to significant sewage dumping and overflows. And this has been a very serious political issue in the UK, with rivers becoming unusable for bathing and water services, and significant amounts of, as I say, sewage being dumped in the sea, and which is not something you would expect for a developed country. The River Thames frequently exceeds the limits allowed for water bathing status, and there have been real issues with the regulators in the UK from the Environment Agency not having the capabilities to deal with the water problems. And this really, really, to me, highlights the issue of privatization of water services and the need for robust regulatory frameworks, and really balancing regional principles to protect public health and environmental sustainability, because obviously water is critical to all life on Earth. And having had water services without this issue for so many years, it coming to the fore over the last 10 years has been a really significant political issue in the UK, and something that obviously we wouldn't suggest replicating in other countries. So it just serves as a warning that you can go from having really advanced water infrastructure, clearly very expensive to maintain, huge amounts of work need to be done. We currently have very leaky pipes, so often you see pipes bursting in the street, not ideal. So when looking at these things in the future, water is a resource, but it is a precious resource that we need to ensure that once you get to a stage where it is available for everyone, you know, there's good sewage functioning in society, it is shocking how quick that can fail without the correct governance processes in place. And I think that's important for us as actuaries to be aware of, because this risk management isn't something that was really thought through as part of this privatization.
Thank you, Emily. Now, Lila, coming back to you, very few people have such a good vantage point as you have on policy and across governments. And we know an aspect like water risk touches on many spheres of government. What is your perspective on the role of policy in managing water risks? And perhaps along with that, a perspective on what is the receptiveness, or how is the reception with governments across the world in adopting modern policies in managing water risks?
Thank you for that. That's a really great question. And I thought perhaps before starting, I just wanted to say I really appreciated Sarah's description of climate and water risk. And I think it's really useful to make that distinction. When we look at water and water-related risks in the OECD, too much, too little polluted waters, we see drivers of these risks, and climate change is one of them, but so too are economic activities, overexploitation of resources, pollution, land use change, etc. So I think that's really important to keep in mind also when you talk about how we manage these risks from a policy perspective. And so I think the first point is it really, water security really relies on a broad regulatory and policy ecosystem. And at the base of the pillar, you have real economy policies, and these have a critical role in shaping resilient economies. So these are policies that can range from freshwater ecosystem protection, policies that define how we use land, how we control or price extraction of water resources or pollution of water. And then also how policymaking is coordinated across different central government bodies, but also at local government level, and how it's implemented and enforced in practice. So it's no use just talking about water in the Environment Ministry, for example. It really needs to be mainstreamed in other ministries in charge of economic development, construction, agriculture, industry, and many more. So it's a very broad area because of the really cross-cutting nature of water. And this is, I think, one of the key challenges is really making sure that water is mainstreamed in this way, and there is the governance around water to make sure that it's being prioritized in the agenda and adequately managed, because there are competing priorities, of course, economic development or developing a specific industry in a country. So it really is managed on a case by case. Every country has a very different approach, and it will depend also on how their economy is composed. And the resources they have available as well, the natural resources and water they have available in the country, and the abundance or scarcity they are experiencing. So that's on the one hand, the real economy side, but we also see a really important role for investment regulation, which in part sheds light on risks and also helps direct finance towards different objectives, including water security or at least managing water-related risks. And so disclosure regulation, due diligence, and taxonomies, these can all influence the availability of data on exposures, risk management practices, and the alignment of investments with environmental objectives. So I won't go into too much detail on that because it sort of moves beyond the scope of this panel, but we really see an important role for these, and understanding where exposure lies, whether it be exposure to a physical risk or a future transition risk because of own activities, for example, pollution of water or over extraction, is really important. But then beyond that, we also have the role of financial authorities, and that's sort of where we're focusing our work right now. And they play this important role in integrating water-related risks into supervisory policies to make sure we're safeguarding our financial systems from water-related shocks. And so we see a really important role for supervisory expectations. So for supervisors to really provide guidance to the banks or the sectors that they're in charge of on assessing and managing risks. But we also see a really important role for central banks, because it also helps elevate these discussions in the agenda. Because if a central bank is thinking about water as a potential risk, then this is a priority for government to be thinking about, for the Ministry of Finance, for the Ministry of Economic Development, or however the government is laid out in that country. So we also see this really important role for financial authorities with the data they have and this broader overview they have of identifying and understanding where the risks lie, so they can also help with this sort of collaboration and agenda setting on addressing water-related risks. And I think that's my last point, is really that collaboration is really key. Everyone's done everyone has really touched on the point that water cuts across so many different areas. So you need all these different ministries to be involved. You need alignment between financial policies and real economy policies. And also on understanding these risks, you need collaboration across lots of different stakeholders from the private sector who have data often, academia who have the models and approaches, and organizations such as yourself, the International Actuarial Association, and organizations such as the OECD and other, to really be touching on this topic from many different fronts.
Thank you, Lila. So coming a bit closer to home to actuarial domain, Hayley, could you highlight for us how water risks relate to non-life actuaries for those in the house? And obviously, in terms of, the economic cycles and multipliers, it touches everyone, but specifically to non-life actuaries.
Yes, sure, absolutely. So I'd say when it comes to the non-life space, the big risk, or the major risk that we've really seen quite a lot lately, is from flooding. And I mean, climate change is making this worse, because we're going to have more intense rainfall in a warmer climate. And I mean, there have been so many different floods that have happened in so many different places around the world. There's actually just too many to mention at this point. But a lot of the discussion that's happened following many of the floods is whether this risk is still insurable. Can insurers actually still continue to provide cover for floods? And I think there are various solutions to this topic. And before we even get to the insurable and uninsurable debate, there's a lot that needs to be done from the point of view of risk management. So, and I mean, if we look at flooding, it can be risk management from the point of view of a homeowner, a business owner, as well as governments and insurers. And it's really imperative to try and identify what is exacerbating flood losses in the non-life space and looking at ways to manage it. I mean, we can actually put in place things as simple for a homeowner to make sure that they have cleared their gutters to actually reduce losses that come from flooding. From a government type of perspective, I mean, there can be very simple solutions like putting in place grids in front of stormwater drains so that they don't get blocked by litter. Or you can have much bigger types of solutions, for example, having sponge cities, where cities take into account the amount of natural areas that they have and try and create more natural areas. So as I say, these types of options range from very simple to much more complex, but it's really the first point that we need to look at is the risk management before we look at the insurable and uninsurable. What we do see, though, around the world is government interventions within the insurance space to address floods. And that's something, I mean, Flood Re in the UK has actually been around since the early 2000s, but we're seeing more and more things like that. And I mean, they were initially set up as an initiative between the government and the insurance industry with the idea of making sure that household insurance for flood still is affordable, because these policies were becoming unaffordable over time. Then, I mean, the other thing on the non-life space is the opposite of flooding is drought. And that's a big thing when it comes to the agricultural space. And, it really is quite critical that, the agriculture sort of areas or industry does have insurance to protect against failed harvests and loss of livestock. And what we do see is in many areas, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, there's parametric insurance is more and more being used here to try and protect the farmers, particularly the small scale farmers, where traditional types of insurance products don't necessarily work. So you need to put in place a lot more innovative type of products. And I think what this actually just brings us back to is exactly what Lila had said, ending off her last point, is that there needs to be a lot of collaboration on these risks within the non-life space. So it's not just something now that the insurers can cover, but it's something that we all need to work together. So as I say, from the insured, the insurer, and governments have to work together to ensure that we can carry on managing water risks and not let it have such a big impact within the non-life area.
Yes, thank you, Ali. Yeah, absolutely. And what I think is quite important is that even if we in silos, the insurers manage their risks appropriately, there's certain risks that just simply cannot be managed individually within companies, and that collaboration part is just so important, so as not to have systemic issues. Sarah, just taking a global perspective, how does water translate globally? Can we think of Would we be wrong to think of it as a global south issue? What perspectives can you share on that front, touching on geographies and socioeconomic strata?
Right. I mean, the quick answer is that no, we cannot think of this as a global south issue. Now, in terms of where does water risk have disastrous consequences, part of that is about economic resilience. And so water risk does both is exacerbated by socioeconomic disparities, and yet it knows no boundaries. So if you take something such as wildfires. Now, wildfires might not be the first thing that we think of with water risk, but what do you need to fight wildfires? One component, not the only component, but one component is water availability and infrastructure. So the infrastructure component is partly tied to the economy. But that degrades over time with increasing intensity and frequency of wildfires and wildfire smoke. I'm in the business of life insurance, and we see the human exposure to wildfire smoke, where that travels across boundaries and is a global problem, really. So, and I could go through all of the other risks to show how they are stretching across geographies, and to a large extent also across socioeconomic strata. So another example in the U.S. is the lack of water, which is more of an issue in the Western U.S. than the Eastern U.S. And the Colorado River is something that I think we touch upon in the paper as being the main source of water in the West. And as that is being diverted, that's a large component of the Western U.S. economy, and that would be at risk in a drought, sustained drought scenario. So that the Colorado River is really the foundation of an economy, and so it comes to the topic of if you look at other examples, can the economy afford desalination technologies? That's not something that every economy can afford. And if you have sustained water risk, it bears the risk of degrading the economy, essentially. So water quality is also at risk. But in terms of, is that a global issue? To some extent, yes. Water quality is at risk. When we look at marine core samples in the ocean, we find increasing concentrations of microplastics. That is also a topic of human health. But there are vastly different concentrations of microplastics depending on where you look in the globe. So there are absolutely differences, but I think we both need to understand the risk as global and also collaborate globally. So that's my
Thanks.
summary.
Thanks for those great examples. And I think what I take from that is that water risk needs to be on the agenda of large corporates, almost no matter where you are.
Yeah. And maybe just to add one more thing, that's also what the insurance industry is there for, right? So when I mentioned resilience and economic resilience, the insurance industry is there for financial security and resilience. So we as actuaries have an important role to play in creating products that are both sustainable and covering the risks that we're facing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, insurability, balance sheet capacity in the nat cat space, all of that plays out, yeah. Emily, one of the case studies we looked at, again from the UK, that was really, we learned so much from it, because it shows that there's things on the menu of actions and mitigations that sometimes we don't think about. And I'm talking about the reintroduction of beavers in the River Otter. If you could tell us a little bit about that study.
Yeah, of course. So it was quite funny, as Sarah's alluded to, having a global perspective. Her global perspective on beavers was quite different to the UK perspective, obviously, them still being plentiful, I understand, in North America relative to the UK, where they've been extinct for hundreds of years. Just to give you some background on why this is so important in the UK, these reintroduction programs. The UK actually ranks in the bottom 10% of the 240 nations and territories for biodiversity intactness. And about 53% of original nature is left intact. The global average for all nations is 77%. This includes things like beavers being hunted to extinction, removal of wolves and bears, etc., etc. And then species studied in the UK have overall declined by 19% since 1970. So we do have a biodiversity crisis within the UK, although it might not be the first place you think of when you think about endangered species. And this has led to a number of issues. So within the agricultural industry in the UK, clearly there's a massive demand for water. As the report says, about 70% of all water demand is from agriculture. And because we've removed so many of these species or they're in decline, we've lost our ability to have these natural water management systems which previously existed. And this has led to a number of sort of innovations and ways to think about it. And there was a beaver re-release program that happened in the southwest of the UK in Devon, and they just wanted to see what would happen. So a lot of the farmers were very resistant to having these beavers released. They saw them as, a pest. They're going to be an issue. They're going to cause lots of problems. And actually, they've been incredibly positive. There are now 20 families living on the River Otter of beavers who are now able to better manage the water system by damming and slowing the water courses down. And this was really positive. So you wouldn't think of the UK as a particularly hot and sunny place. You'd see that we have a lot of rainfall. However, over the last few years with climate change and what's been happening, we have had significant periods of drought stress that we've not really seen before. And that combined with the water mismanagement systems we've got in place have been caused significant issues with regards to drought. For example, this year we had a particularly hot summer. We're now looking at one of our worst harvests ever, which is obviously really suboptimal. But when you look at where the beavers have been reintroduced relative to where there are no beavers, there is a significant change in looking at the vegetation. So there were some wonderful satellite images of, the areas where the beavers were being sort of green and plentiful, and water still being available even in these very stressed times. Whereas actually in the surrounding areas where there were no beavers, it was very, very arid, and there were no crops growing. So that's really changed, the perception. And actually this work to increase biodiversity, reverse centuries of habitat loss, and bring into practice more sustainable farming practices. We were already seeing the benefits of that in these localized pockets where it's happened. So it's something that you're seeing more drivers behind, and really fits into the kind of mitigation adaptation. Bringing that together with biodiversity, is really positive, and can, significantly improve the water situation with actually fairly limited investment. It's just being open-minded to try these things. And I think as soon as somebody sees it being successful, their crop yields being higher, people get on board and think, actually, maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll see how beavers can change our water system. And I think that's been really positive.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, I must say that was a heartwarming example. Lila, you mentioned central banks before, and in the context of policy. One of the projects that the OECD has worked on was the Hungarian Central Bank in relation to nature-related financial risks and the role of water. Could you highlight a bit of the learnings from that for us?
Yes, of course. And so it was nice to hear Emily's intervention on the solution side. So I guess I'm taking a step back to the risk identification side, but with view of potential solutions, including nature-based solutions on the horizon. As I mentioned before, we're working closely with central banks, and so far the focus has been on climate related risks, and that's been the priority for the financial sector, and in general that's been how we've been looking at these risks. But now the attention has shifted slightly towards this broader lens of nature, as I've mentioned a few times, and this is particularly since 2022 with the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. But what's interesting is when we take this broader lens of trying to understand nature-related risks, so the implications of disruption of ecosystem services on the economy and on the financial system, when we start looking at those, once again, we were realizing that water is really emerging as one of the key drivers of risk. So this is and the same, we find the same thing when we're looking at physical climate risks as well. So water really becomes a central part of both assessments of nature-related financial risks and climate-related financial risks. And so at the OC, we've been collaborating with in different ways on the topic of nature. And in particular, we worked with the Hungarian Central Bank, some of my colleagues here, to develop a supervisory framework for assessing nature-related financial risks. Because this is something that's very much at a nascent stage. So even trying to have this conceptual framework of how do you understand nature-related financial risks, how do central banks approach this? So now we've advanced a bit since this was 2023, 2024, and more central banks are working on this. But at the time when we were working on this project, it was really trying to first of all understand the tools, data, and metrics and frameworks that are out there, and designing a framework that the Hungarian Central Bank could use. And then when they implemented this framework to understand where some of these risks are, once again, water was found to be a key driver of risk. So they looked at drought scenarios, and found that Hungary faces significant physical risks in sectors like agriculture and manufacturing, experiencing up to a 53% output reduction under severe drought scenarios. And these financial risks included non-performing loans and market risks tied to sovereign debt quality, potentially increasing debt to GDP ratios by 2.8%. But what's particularly interesting is they also found that over 50% of Hungary's high-risk financial instruments were concentrated in just 5 banks, which increases this potential for systemic risks. So this is something we're continuing to follow in the OECD. And so next year, in fact, we're collaborating with the Central Bank of Spain on organizing, as I mentioned before, this roundtable on financing water. And the idea is really to tackle this topic of water-related risks from different angles. So understanding what is the role, what are the risks for financial stability, what is the role for policymakers, but also touching on topics like insurance, reinsurance, corporate transition plans. How do these all link together? Because it's such a multifaceted issue that we need to really tackle from different angles for many reasons, but also for ensuring financial stability.
Absolutely agreed. Thank you. So, Hailey, one of the most frightening concepts I came across when we were writing the paper is the concept of water wars. And so I was wondering, if you think of resource scarcity of almost any kind, particularly essential resources, can you highlight how water-related risks can contribute to types of conflict, including social unrest, forced migration, and so forth? And of course, these risks affect everyone in business and otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we say, it just shows how water is so connected to other things. And this is actually one that I'm particularly close to because, I work for Actuary, which is a government pool covering terrorism or damage from the perils of terrorism, as well as strikes, riots, and civil commotion. And what we're seeing in South Africa right now is that we have a lot of social unrest that's happening as a result of water shortages. And we've been paying numerous claims for this exact reason, where we have water issues sparking protests. And generally, the reason in South Africa is due to poor maintenance and infrastructure that's happening, that's creating those sorts of protests. But around the world, there's so many other sort of issues that have sparked protests. In Bolivia, there were mass protests which followed the privatization of the municipal water supply and led to massive price hikes. So that was mass protests from that. Elsewhere, we've seen, in Flint, Michigan, in the US, there were protests following the fact that there was lead in the drinking water there. And what even wider than that is what's been seen around the world is there were food price riots which happened in around 2007. And those riots were happening in places like Haiti, Bangladesh, numerous countries in Africa. And part of the reason that the food price had increased is because there were droughts in big food producing regions like Russia and Australia. So it wasn't even in those exact areas where the water risk was that created that issue. And then I think beyond the social unrest, there's just many other conflicts that happen around water. We see there's always transboundary water issues. So these are generally as a result of large infrastructure type of projects. So one example being in Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which was built to be a big hydropower dam, but it really needs to balance the needs of 250 million people or so who are downstream from that dam, and their water needs also need to be considered in years where there may be a drought and there may be less water getting to that. So there was a lot of conflict around that. Even within countries, there can be quite contentious issues around water. So in India, there's been the idea of putting in place what they call the Indian National River Linking Project, where they want to move water from areas where there's surplus to areas where there's a deficit. But there's so many challenges and contentions around this that even though it's been in the pipeline for 50 years, it still hasn't happened. You can also say, when we talked about forced migration, construction of mega dams creates forced migration there. The Three Gorges Dam in China was said to have displaced around 1.3 million people. So that's sort of long-term livelihood impacts that we see there. And then one final thing that when it comes to water and conflict is the idea of water-related terrorism. And that's the idea that water systems can actually become sort of strategic targets during a conflict. And this has been seen a few times before. One of the times was in 2014 in Somalia, where the Al-Shabaab militants actually sabotaged water infrastructure and cut off the water supplies with the idea that they wanted to force the residents to have to rely on the areas under their control. So we can see there are just so many different challenges and just how wide water risks can become.
Absolutely, and we're seeing regulators around the world expecting banks, for instance, to understand their counterparties' exposure to climate risks. And one can just see how interesting that gets when you see water as a key production resource as well. Now, Heidi, you have spoken about the impact on general insurers, but Sarah, I want to ask you if you can just elaborate a little bit on the impact on life, pensions, and health in terms of water risk.
Sure. I think I've partially touched on it, but one component, sweeping generalizations, but life and pensions is a long-term liability and managing long-term assets. Property insurance tends to be shorter term, where not that it's not subject to water and climate risk, and it's already upon the industry. But in life and pensions, at least, those are long-term liabilities, which make long-term scenario-based projections a key tool for the industry. And while it may be true that certain life insurance portfolios and pension risk doesn't see water risk as a material impact today. In some ways, it's in some ways it is embedded in the risk already, and in other ways, it will increase in the future through the span of the duration, if you will. And so I've given a couple of examples. I mentioned spread of diseases, stranded assets on the asset side. And when we think of transition risk, that is an important area of both understanding, classification, and modeling. And while the field is emerging and a lot of the methodologies and data, we still have gaps. It's important to lay the foundations and also, as Lila mentioned, to collaborate. I'll just close out by saying that in various emerging risks that I've witnessed over the decades, when actuaries are faced with trying to understand a new risk, what do? We have things in our tool belt, but we also need to work with other experts, such as hydrologists, climate scientists, and CAT modeling. There's a wealth of other both organizations and professions to work alongside. So,
thanks, Sarah. Agreed. So we have a question from the audience, which I'm going to pose to Emily. Question states, in the water as a resource perspective, have you considered whether and how water prices internalize water risks?
Yeah, so short answer, no, they absolutely do not internalize water risks at the moment. The key thing here really is the kind of inequality of water usage, which I think Hayley alluded to earlier with water justice. So you see kind of the top few percent of people in many countries using up to 50% of the overall water as far as human consumption goes. And clearly, pricing mechanisms can be put in place to try and disincentivize this overusage of water by often ultra high net worth individuals. So there were some interesting cases in California when they had the big drought. The police and other environmental agencies were going and knocking on celebrities' houses saying, hey, your grass looks really green. Are you sure you're not irrigating it? How often are you refreshing your swimming pool? Because actually people need to drink this water. This isn't just for your leisure activities. So there has also been talk around putting progressive water pricing in place. So for example, ensuring that a basic amount of water would be, very affordable. And then as you start to use more and more and kind of taking more than your fair share of the water supply, then prices would increase significantly. So that's something Hayley and I have talked about looking into further, and it's something that's on our work schedule. So hopefully we'll have a more concrete answer for you there, but currently, absolutely not. Water pricing is not helping this situation, and often you know, in the UK, as I've mentioned, there have been a lot of issues with the privatisation of water companies. Water bills have risen significantly in Scotland. So this is England and Wales. In Scotland, they've kept the water companies public, and they haven't seen such significant rises in water and prices. And that has been exacerbated in other areas of the world where you are seeing a significant amount of people's actual personal income. For example, in Madagascar, needing to be spent on getting an adequate water supply. So it's something we are very conscious of, and I think is a really useful question to raise. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, and you know, the elasticity of demand and prices in terms of utilities or by no means a trivial matter. We have unfortunately come to the end of the hour, and so I want to first of all thank my very capable panel and co-authors. Thank you for participating, and then to everybody who dialed in. Watch this space. We will be producing more material and not only reports, and so see you on the next one. Have a good afternoon, evening, and morning, everyone.